Okay, lecture 24. I had hoped to devote a good portion of this lecture to talking about Marx's views about the state. That's what's advertised on the syllabus. But as you know, I'm falling a little bit behind. And as I've gotten these lectures together, I've realized I've underestimated the difficulty of what I needed to say about Marx's criticisms of capitalism. Marx's general analysis of capitalism is, of course, just about the most difficult part of his overall theory, but it's also the most important part of his theory. So I've decided to continue on the line I was on in the last lecture and complete in this lecture my presentation of Marx's basic analysis and critique of capitalism, holding off the discussion of Marx on the state until the final lecture. I mean, fortunately, Marx's views about the state are relatively speaking straightforward, and so I think I can present that relatively quickly in the first part of that final lecture, and then use it as a segue to make some final concluding comments about the course as a whole and the trajectory we've traveled from Bacon through to Marx, which is what I'll do in that lecture. Okay, so let me push on into my discussion of capitalism. Okay, some review. So as you know, according to Marx, capitalism is a historically particular economic formation. It's not a universal feature of economic organization. It's one that gets going in the modern period. It involves, therefore, Marx thinks, certain distinctive relations of production, and especially it involves the division of society into two major economic groups, two major classes. There are the dominant bourgeois, as Marx calls them. They command most of the wealth and control the means of production. They're the ones who have access to raw materials, to land, to physical plants, to equipment, to various other resources that are necessary to run businesses, enterprises, firms, farms, and so on, right? So on the one hand, you've got a dominant class with money to burn and access to the means of production. And in practice, in capitalism, they're the social group, Marx thinks, that makes most of the most consequential decisions about how productive investment is made and what kinds of businesses, what kinds of commodities, what kinds of goods and services are made available to society and on what terms. Then you've got a subservient class, the majority of relatively impoverished individuals who have little to sell but their labor. This is the group that Marx sometimes refers to as the proletariat, and he means simply the working class. And his picture of capitalist society is as a society that, for all of its trumpeting about freedom and oppression, remains basically a class society structured around subordination of one class by another. Right? That's the very general picture. Finally, and we started to see this in the last lecture, capitalism appears to participants in a certain way. This is partly a matter of ideology, but it's partly a matter of what capitalism actually looks like, right? I mean, if you look around and you see capitalism going on, you look at people signing contracts, lawyers overseeing various kinds of mergers and acquisitions, see people entering a factory, signing a labor contract. This is what appears to be going on, right? When you look at capitalism at first glance in that way. Marx thinks that when you look at capitalism as a participant, it appears to you as a system basically in which commodities, goods, services circulate and exchange among individuals who are equally situated relative to one another. They make these exchanges on, ideally anyway, a voluntary, consensual basis, and everyone receives their due. Everyone is treated fairly and justly, in the ideal case anyway, in this circulation and exchange. That's the way capitalism appears to people caught up within it, Marx thinks, but Marx's critique of capitalism, and I hinted this already in the last lecture, and I'm going to explain more now. Marx thinks that this third feature, this apparent, this superficial carapace of appearance that capitalism refracts, it's importantly mistaken because it mystifies the terms on which surplus value is derived from capitalist economic production and then controlled by the bourgeoisie. Remember, surplus value is that proportion of wealth that is produced by the economic system that it doesn't, strictly speaking, need to allow individuals and the system itself to subsist, to maintain itself. Surplus value is anything on top of that. And Marx thinks, as you know, that in capitalism it's the bourgeoisie that control that surplus value and extract that surplus value. He thinks it's very important to understand how they do it, because this picture of goods and services circulating against the background of consent and freedom and all the rest of it, Marx thinks that's very misleading. It mystifies what's really going on, and it mystifies how this surplus value is extorted. So Marx's question becomes, look, capitalist employers confront workers on the labor market as free, independent agents. We're not slaves anymore. We're all independent and free with the rights of man, right? But given that, how, Marx asks, under these conditions, can it both be true that as commodities exchange freely and consensually on the market, it turns out that workers receive a just wage, on the one hand, workers receive their due, and at the same time, how could it also be true that capitalists are able to make a profit on their investments as their due? That, of course, is equivalent in a way in Marx's formula to saying, how is it possible for capitalists to extract surplus value? Because profit, in his account, is wealth that is extracted from the economy, from the productive process, on top of what is needed to simply keep the system ticking away, right? So profit and surplus value, very, very closely equivalent terms in Marx. How is it possible, Marx thinks, that this can happen simultaneously in a system in which we're all independent, we all freely exchange our commodities, and it just turns out that the workers receive their just wage, their due, and at the same time, luckily for them, capitalists make profits. They end up controlling the surplus value. How does that happen? How is this trick pulled off? After all, workers have nothing to sell but their labor, usually in the standard case, and they sell their labor to secure their lives, to make a living, or to receive, as we might say, a living wage. They're not particularly motivated by profit, right? And they're certainly not getting very much of the surplus value, right? I mean, that's not to say that they wouldn't, if someone gave them the opportunity to make an awful lot of money for themselves and to garner some of the surplus value in their society, that's not to say they wouldn't take it. It's just that very, very few workers in capitalist societies are in a position to even think about getting their hands on much of the surplus value. Their basic social situation is such that they have little to sell but their labor, and when they sell their labor to a capitalist or an employer, their major motivation is to be able to survive, to be able to make a living, to receive a living wage, right? But with capitalists, of course, it's very different. The capitalist is already wealthy, almost by definition. The capitalist starts with wealth, or what we might call capital. And the question for him or her is, what do I do with all of this money, right? I mean, they could just sit around and do nothing. But of course, capitalists don't do that. They seek typically to invest it in production in order to obtain a profitable return. And that's how and why they engage the assistance of workers, right? In number one there, right? They hire workers in a business, in a firm, in a factory, whatever it is, because they hope that by recruiting them to the productive enterprise that they're doing, they will be in a position to end the deal with more capital than they put into the business, right? The capitalist is not trying just to obtain a living, not just trying to obtain a living wage. They're not worried about bare survival. they've got the resources to do perfectly well. What's driving the capitalist, at least the archetypical capitalist in Marx's view, is the profit motive, the desire to increase their overall capital. And Marx's question basically is, how does this happen? How do capitalists increase their capital, increase their wealth, as per 2 there, by entering voluntary labor contracts with workers as per 1, workers who have nothing to sell but their labor? Or in other words, how does capitalism allow those 2 conditions to coexist, 1 and 2, in a way that makes and produces surplus value? And Marx's aim in his later economic analysis, especially in Das Kapital, and this is what I'm going to try to explain, is to, as he puts it, force the secret of capitalist surplus value by analyzing the nature of commodity exchange, which he thinks is the central feature of modern market society. So Marx begins, as you perhaps know, by giving us a conceptualization of what a commodity is. If you're going to understand what's being circulated and exchanged, you need to understand what a commodity is. And he gives a definition of a commodity. He says, look, for something to be a commodity, it must satisfy 3 conditions. And I think these are 3 necessary and jointly sufficient conditions in Marx's analysis. First of all, for something to be a commodity, it has to be a product of labor. It has to be available thanks to someone's effort or work, right? Mountains, which are just there, right? I mean, they certainly bring us enjoyment and we like to see them, right? But they're not products of anyone's labor. And so they can't count as commodities on Marx's understanding. Secondly, in order to be a commodity, something must have utility of a particular kind, Marx thinks. It has to have what he calls social use value. And what he means by this is, in the first instance, I mean, to say that something has use value for Marx simply means that it is useful relative to somebody's need, right? You know, if I need something, then if I have some need to consume food, right, then food will have use value relative to my need, right? That's a very, very simple idea. But notice that in order for a commodity to exist, Marx thinks it's not enough that it just have use value itself, because there are lots of things that have use value that aren't commodities. So, for example, an apple hanging on the tree in the state of nature has use value. If I pick it for myself, I eat it and I satisfy my desire for an apple, right? But it hasn't become a commodity at that stage, right? Because it's only my use value that's at stake. I want something, there's the apple, I'm hungry, I pick the apple, I eat the apple, that's it. But there's no commodity, it doesn't become commodified in this transaction. And the reason is that in order for something to be a commodity, it must serve someone else's need such that it is intended to be sold to some third party whose need is purporting to be met, right? So secondly, a commodity must have social use value. And thirdly, Marx says, a commodity must be a product of labor, must have social value, and it must be susceptible of having exchange value. That is, it must be worth something in some numerically expressed ratio relative to other commodities, right? And this is, of course, a familiar fact about markets, right? You go to the market and you see numbers on everything, right? What do those numbers represent? Those numbers represent, for Marx anyway, the relative exchange value of different prices, of different commodities, right? So if I go down one aisle and I see, a biscuit tin, right, that is going for $10, right, and I go down a different aisle and I see that chewing gum is going for $5, right? there's a ratio of exchange there. What that means is that today, anyway, given the going rate of prices, one biscuit tin is worth the equivalent of 2 packets of chewing gum, right? And exchange value is what allows us to make these quantitative comparisons of the relative worth of one commodity compared to another. Marx thinks, well, that's how all commodities are. They're products of labor, they have social use value, and they have this property of exchange value. They have this ability to be commensurated with all other commodities on the market, such that we can always say, typically using money or some financial measure, this is worth X times that, or you need to buy a certain number of these in order to be able to have something that is equivalent in exchange value to this, right? This is a straightforward thought, I hope. Now, Marx, at this point, takes over an idea that is already latent in the work of the classical political economists, people like Adam Smith and Ricardo. The idea is that exchange value, this property that allows commodities to be commensurated with the whole universe of other commodities in these kind of proportional, numerically expressible ratios, right? That property of exchange value cannot depend on 2, right? It can't be a function of use value, but it must be in some way a function of 1. It must have something to do with the fact that commodities are products of labor. Why does he and Smith and Ricardo, why do they all think that? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is use values, the extent to which something serves someone's need, they're very, very difficult to compare and quantify. They're in effect incommensurable, right? So, think of a 3-iron, the vegetable a leek, or screws, piano wire, the skill hand-eye coordination, right? These are all things that could be traded in a way on the market, right? When a brilliant basketball player or ballet dancer signs a labor contract with the Kirov Ballet or the LA Lakers, right? They're in effect selling their hand-eye coordination on the basketball court or on the stage for whatever their salary or wage is supposed to be, right? So it has a certain hand-eye coordination, has a certain use value relative to the game of basketball or the practice of ballet, right? Piano wire has a certain use value, when you're stringing a piano and tuning it. Screws have all sorts of use values. They can be used for this, that, and the other purpose. Leeks, probably basically food. 3-iron has a use value that's connected to golf, right? Very, very diverse sets of human needs determine the use value of these various different possible commodities, but they are not, Marx thinks, things that you can bring under some single quantitative standard, right? They're too psychologically and culturally variable, dependent on completely unquantifiable physical characteristics. You're just not going to be able to see anything in these differences that will enable us to say, well, this is worth 3 times as much as that. 16 screws is equal to 1 piece of piano wire, right? How are you going to derive that ratio from just looking at them and thinking about their different possible use value, thinking about the different kinds of needs that they satisfy? Marx thinks, and again, Smith and Ricardo agree with him, that's too unstable a basis on which to try to explain exchange value. Smith and Ricardo are also famously struck by a famous paradox about value involving water and diamonds, right? They notice, along with a lot of other skeptics, look, water is really, really useful, and diamonds are actually really pretty useless. They don't do a whole lot for you except for, jewelry and vanity and so forth. But without water, you couldn't live, right? So that would suggest that the use value of water is super high, and the use value of diamonds is super low, right? But in the market, it turns out that diamonds are typically quite expensive, and water is virtually free, right? And Smith and Ricardo and a lot of people in the 18th century decide, well, that shows that a use value theory of economic value can't work, because whatever exchange value is based on, it can't be based on utility. So Smith, Ricardo, and also Marx say, well, exchange value has to be being measured not in terms of use value, because use value is just too variable, and it gives you bad answers to questions about the exchange value of water and diamonds, right? You can't measure exchange value in terms of use value. You've got to think of it as being determined on the basis of some cross-cultural, historically universal standard. And again, following Smith and Ricardo, Marx assumes that number one on your slide there, labor, and especially labor time, what he's going to call abstract labor, affords such a standard. In taking this line, I'll just mention this, I don't want to talk about it, it gets into some very complicated issues. In taking this line that focuses on labor as the standard and measure of exchange value, Marx is agreeing with the classical political economists, but thereby taking a line that economists today have mostly rejected, because most economics that's taught in the economics department today, for example here and elsewhere, is neoclassical economics, and neoclassical economics has abandoned many of the assumptions of classical political economy, Smith, Ricardo, folks like them, and they have restored the idea that exchange value has something to do with use value or utility, although they now understand utility in very, very different terms from the way in which Bentham or Mill or Smith and Ricardo would have understood it, because they've got a complicated story about how utility needs to be more narrowly understood as marginal utility. Now, I don't have time to go into all of that. Just keep in mind that although Marx is definitely trying to criticize economics, he's criticizing classical political economy, and the form in which intellectual academic economics appears to us today is a little bit different from the form of it that Marx was criticizing in the mid-19th century. That complicates the effort to assess his criticisms of capitalism, but it's not something I can get into, unfortunately, now. So, for Marx, to say that commodities are all exchangeable in quantifiable ratios on a market, which is just, how capitalism appears to us, is, he thinks, to presuppose that they share some common property that allows them to be compared quantifiably in that way, to be commensurated in the form of prices, rates of exchange, right? So if some commodity, say it's gold, a car, or a dress, is worth a certain amount of commodity B, whether it be silver, a diamond, a wheelbarrow, whatever, there must be some common measure, some underlying socially valid currency of value that determines the rate at which they tend to exchange. And as we've seen for Marx following Ricardo and Smith, use values too unstable, too heterogeneous to serve as such a currency, and therefore Marx assumes that labor has to be in some socially valid, abstract, measurable form. That must be what determines exchange value. And so accordingly, Marx accepts, at least for the sake of argument, it's not actually totally clear to me that Marx fully endorses what is called the labor theory of value, but he certainly brings it into the analysis for the sake of argument and offers a version of it. And according to the version of the argument Marx accepts, the exchange value of commodities is, broadly speaking, determined by what Marx calls the socially necessary labor time, the SNLT, I'm going to call it, required to produce them. And what he means by this is that at any given historical moment, given the level of technological development, given the particular needs of a society, given the climate conditions, given any number of historically contingent factors, manufacturing a commodity is going to take on average, a certain number of human labor hours to create, right? At different times, that average will be larger or smaller, right? Depends on the technology, right? If we're trying to dig coal out of the ground with our bare hands, right, it's going to take a lot longer to dig coal out of the ground than it is when we have, incredibly powerful drills and tunnelers that can get us down very, very deep, smash up the coal seam, conveyor belts to bring the coal back up, and so forth. When we've got machinery and technology to assist us, the average amount of time that it's going to take human beings to extract a single piece of coal out of the ground is going to massively diminish. But that's the general hypothesis, right? The general hypothesis is that on average, two commodities that take, roughly speaking, given the level of historical and technological development, two commodities that on average take the same amount of hours to be produced by human beings at that time, they will tend to exchange on the market as equivalents, right? So it takes you, or it takes people in general, roughly 3 hours a day to produce a little topiary that gets sold in a shop, right? It takes me about 3 hours to make a nice birthday cake, right? Or on average, it takes people roughly about 3 hours to make a nice birthday cake, right? So you'd expect, Marx is saying, the prices, the exchange value of these two commodities to be roughly equivalent, since it requires roughly the same amount of average labor time to produce them, right? So that's where Marx thinks exchange value comes from. It comes from these ratios between the average amount of labor time that's necessary to produce different kind of commodities at different times. But then Marx makes his crucial move, right? He says, well, how then should we think about the wage in capitalism, right? Because that's one of the things we're interested in. What determines the just wage under capitalism, right? And what Marx says at this point is very important. He says, well, look, remember, capitalism has done away with slavery, right? The factory owner no longer owns their workers in the way that the masters under slave conditions owned their slaves, right? We've got rid of all of that. In capitalism, we don't enslave people anymore. We're all independent, voluntary exchanges, right? So how then should we think about the deal that is struck between the worker and the capitalist? And Marx says, well, what happens under capitalism is that labor power becomes a commodity, right? It becomes the thing that workers sell, right? They're not selling themselves as they would if they were a slave, right? We start to think of their labor power, right, as a commodity that they have to offer on the market, and that it itself has a price, and that price, of course, is a wage, right? But he says, look, if labor power is a commodity, right, then it's going to have all of the properties I've described commodities as having. It is going to be itself a product of labor, right? It will only exist because other people work to produce it. Secondly, it's going to have social use value and an exchange value. And of course, its social use value is going to be, as we'll discover in a moment, that labor power is a source of profit and surplus value for capitalists. That's its social use value. That's the need that under capitalism, labor power exists to serve. It doesn't exist to serve the needs of the laborer. Its primary social use value as a capitalist commodity is to serve the need of capital for surplus value and profit, right? But it's also going to have an exchange value, right? And its exchange value, Marx says, if labor power is thought of as a commodity, its exchange value is going to be determined in exactly the same way as the exchange value of any other commodity. So its exchange value will boil down to the socially necessary labor time required to produce that commodity, required to produce labor power and make it available for sale on the labor market, right? And his thought here is this, right? The socially necessary labor time required to produce or reproduce labor power is equivalent to the socially necessary labor time required to produce or reproduce those goods and services that a worker needs in order to be able to live and to be available for work, right? That's the exchange value of labor power, the exchange value of their labor on the market. That's the market wage. So the socially necessary labor time required to reproduce and produce commodities is whatever labor is needed to feed the worker, to keep them relatively healthy, to give them a place of shelter where they can sleep overnight so that they can have enough energy to work productively the next day, right? These are all underlying labor requirements that make the commodity labor power available, right? If the worker is sick, or if the worker has scurvy, or if the worker is too shattered and exhausted to do anything, or is falling asleep all the time, then their labor power won't be much good, right? They won't be a particularly productive worker. So in order for labor power to be available as a commodity, we have to provide for workers enough to leave them available to live and be available to work the next day with enough energy, right? But that means, of course, the actual exchange value of labor power will itself correspond to a concrete number of labor hours, the socially necessary labor time that is needed to provide food, clothing, shelter, and so on, sanitation for workers, so that they actually have some labor power to sell. And that means the cost of labor power, the wage in capitalism according to Marx, will be equivalent to the exchange value of any commodity requiring the same socially necessary labor time, right? But, and this is the crucial move, right? Their market power enables employers to specify the length of the working day in the factory, say, or on the farm. And the hours in the working day typically exceed the socially necessary labor time that is needed to keep the worker alive and that determines the worker's wage, right? This is, of course, the key point where Marx is going to say this is where surplus value is extracted in the factory and under capitalism. Because suppose that the socially necessary labor time for the production of the commodity labor power on a daily basis equals 5 hours, right? That is, on average, it's going to take your average human person 5 hours of time a day to produce the stuff that a worker needs to be able to live and survive and be available to work, right? To produce the sheets that she needs to sleep on, to produce the bread, the eggs, the milk that she needs to eat at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, to maintain whatever systems of sanitation are in her house, to make sure she doesn't get desperately ill and is available for work the next day. It doesn't matter the details. Whatever it is, it takes, on average, 5 hours of human labor to make available to the worker those things that she needs to have her labor power intact and ready to offer to an employer the next day, right? So that's going to correspond to a certain amount of labor time, and it's going to correspond to a certain exchange value, because it's then going to be equivalent in exchange value to any other commodity that roughly on average costs the same amount of labor time to make available and produce, right? That's how labor power becomes another commodity that is exchanged in just the same way according to a certain price as everything else. Screws, hammers, 3 irons, cars, are all part of some big universe of commodities that are exchanged on the market, right? So let's suppose, again, that at a particular moment, the socially necessary labor time to produce labor power per day is 5 hours, and that's going to be roughly X dollars, right? That's going to be the wage, right? So the worker sells his labor power to the capitalist for X dollars for basically 5 hours worth of work. That's the just competitively determined wage, Marx thinks, and here he's agreeing with the capitalist. But the worker then agrees to work in the factory not just for 5 hours, but for 10 hours a day. And that extra labor is then plowed into the products that are manufactured in the factory. And that, of course, increases their value, because the source of exchange value, Marx thinks, is the amount of average labor that is put into things, right? So if you're increasing the average amount of labor that is being done in factories, right, then the products that are coming out of those factories will tend, on average, to be proportionately more pricey, proportionately more expensive. They will fetch a higher exchange value in rough proportion, right? So in our example, the worker agrees to work for the capitalist for 10 hours a day, right? Gets his X dollars in return, which is equivalent to 5 hours worth of work. But in this analysis, the capitalist gets 100% return on his X dollars of investment, his wage that he pays the worker, because the worker works double the time that is actually equivalent to the time needed to keep him or her alive. So the worker adds X dollars worth of additional labor value to the products that are produced in the factory. And that additional time, Marx thinks, that's where surplus value comes from in capitalism. That's the source of capitalist profit. And once you understand that, you're bound to see that this is an exploitative system in which, as he likes to put it, dead labor lives vampire-like on living labor. He talks about dead labor because the capitalist access to resources, the wealth he or she has accumulated, that represents the dead labor of prior workers who've helped her build it up. One of the great political economists, Frédéric Bastiat, once said, political economy is exchange. And Marx would have given a strong reply to that. He'd have said, yes, political economy represents capitalism as free exchange, but it obscures what's really going on. What's really going on is a politics of oppressive class domination. You have initially violent, primitive accumulation in which the capitalists kick the peasants off the land, and then this complex system of hidden exploitation carried on privately behind factory gates, in which employers increase the length of the working day, try to squeeze as much labor as they can out of workers who are being paid the just subsistence wage, supported by the liberal state, what Marx sometimes calls the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. I'll talk about the state in the next lecture. Notice, I don't think Marx's objection here is that the capitalist steals profit and surplus value from workers or is treating him or her unjustly. Marx, I think, accepts the capitalist argument that the just wage is determined by the market as the price of the commodity labor power, and it will typically be a subsistence wage because the price of commodities is determined by whatever is socially necessary to produce them, right? Whatever labor is socially necessary to produce them. And in the case of labor power, that means whatever is socially necessary to keep the worker alive, right? So Marx kind of accepts the capitalist story about what the just wage is. And this conception of justice, this idea that workers are entitled to a subsistence wage and no more, right? That conception of justice, Marx would say, is socially valid relative to the capitalist mode of production, because this is a feature of the ideological superstructure that gets erected around the capitalist mode of production. So this idea about the just wage for him is an aspect of capitalist ideology. It's part of what he wants to criticize. So that's why I don't think, to go back to something I said earlier, it's helpful to think of Marx as saying, well, I've got an ideal standard of justice, and when you apply that standard of justice, capitalism looks like it's unjust. I don't think that's the way Marx's argument works at all. I think he thinks, well, look, in capitalism, a certain standard of justice is going to be valid, and it turns out that under that capitalist standard of justice, the worker has no valid complaint against the capitalist, because the worker receiving a subsistence wage is receiving the just wage under the regnant ideal of justice. And again, people often get Marx wrong there, but I think it's actually his view. Still, the ideology is part of what he's criticizing, and as you know, Marx thinks that this ideology mystifies and conceals something. But I think what Marx thinks that it conceals is not a maldistribution of economic resources, or not some kind of injustice in the way in which economic power and economic resources are made available and distributed to people. Certainly not that there's an inequality here. That's not what Marx is concerned about. Rather, what the ideology conceals is not maldistribution of resources, but a more basic social fact, the fact of class domination, the fact that the economic power of the bourgeoisie, their complete stranglehold over the means of production, basically enables them to dictate the terms of labor to those they hire, and makes them the de facto residual claimants, to use a legal term you might want to look up, makes them the de facto residual claimants of the proceeds of that labor. They get to squeeze in the factory, by bossing people around, to squeeze additional labor, force people to do overtime, threaten, bully, right, prevent them from going to the bathroom too often, etc., etc. They get to force workers to work ever harder. And in doing so, of course, more and more labor gets put into the products that are manufactured in the factory, right? But the capitalist then claims the proceeds of all of that additional labor as surplus value, and then they get to control it. They control that surplus value in the form of future investment, and that's the way the system reproduces itself. So, summing up, at the heart of capitalism is then, for Marx, a particular commodity, labor power, that is, on the one hand, human, right? We're not just talking about some, physical object. We're talking about people's lives here, and that's important for Marx, whose social use value is basically to serve the capitalist's need to secure a profit. That use value is determined not by a real human need, right? It's not determined by a need that can be identified with any particular human being. Rather, the need to secure a profit is the need of an impersonal system. It's a need of a social formation, capitalism, seeking to reproduce itself. That's why he likes this metaphor of, capitalism, a system in which dead labor rules over living labor, because the dead labor is what the bourgeois capitalists accumulate. That's what gives them control over the raw materials. That's what enables them to start production, start a factory, and so forth. And that's what gives them the market power to take in these workers who have no other means of life, to bring them in, squeeze them in the factory, squeeze as much labor out of them as possible, and then give them a subsistence wage, right? That's Marx's picture. The use value of labor power in capitalism is, according to Marx, realized in the extraction of surplus value from workers, which, as we now know, occurs, Marx thinks, by making workers work for X plus N hours, where X is equivalent to the socially necessary labor time for labor power to be available, for workers to live, to be basically subsisting, and then N is the source of any surplus value that is extracted on top. Workers, and to a significant extent capitalists too, are then trapped within relations of production that subordinate their real powers and needs to those of an impersonal system. Capitalism is thus endemically oppressive because it involves, going back to some of the themes in the earlier lectures, alienated control over human powers. I'll say more about this in the next lecture, but keep in mind this point about justice. Increasing the share of profits enjoyed by workers by engaging, for example, in state redistribution, Marx thinks won't work, right? Because this exploitative relationship is endemic, it's systemic to the capitalist system itself, right? If we made sure that the workers made nothing less than every hour they actually put into the products that get sold on by the capitalist, then the capitalist would be unable to make a profit from hiring them. And if the capitalist would be unable to make a profit, they wouldn't hire them. That's why if we try, as many economists today, of course, argue, and Marx in a funny kind of way would have agreed with them, you increase the minimum wage here, right? Because we want to protect people from humiliating sweatshop conditions and humiliating work conditions and so forth, and give them a better chance in life. You increase wages here, or you redistribute here in our country. But what will happen if you do that? Well, all you'll do is capital will become less and less interested in hiring people who insist on receiving that level of wage, right? Because capital wants to lower labor costs as much as possible. And so what will happen is capital will move elsewhere where labor is cheaper. And of course, that's exactly what we see in the modern world. That's why most of these sweatshops that manufacture the clothes you're currently wearing are located in far-flung parts of South Asia, for example, where people are willing to work for far less than they would here. So you can't solve the problem just by playing musical chairs and trying to restore the share of the profits that the capitalist creams off to the workers, right? Because the more you do that, the more you will undermine the whole point of capitalism, which is to produce a surplus from the manufacturing system itself. So that won't work. That's why Marx thinks liberation requires the violent revolutionary reappropriation of these powers. So to sum up, capitalism for Marx is exploitative and oppressive because agents' needs are subordinated to the imperatives of a blind and impersonal system. We are ruled, as Marx says, by a fetishism of commodities. The bourgeoisie oversees this commodity fetishism because in practice its members determine how production is to proceed, which commodities are to be produced. But note that that is not at all the same thing as saying that the bourgeoisie freely organize production based on an impartial, rationally informed conception of human needs. Individual capitalists are in a relation of mutual competition and are primarily motivated by the imperative of conserving and, if possible, increasing their capital. And they're constantly second-guessing the market, trying to find an angle that they think will be able to preserve and increase their capital for their shareholders or something like that, right? So what's dictating the bourgeoisie's behavior is certainly not something that looks like a rational consideration of human interests. What's determining their decision-making is the highly stressful, highly capricious, competitive environment of the economy, right? And so the whole thing is being ruled by something that is kind of out of control, by kind of blind competitive forces. That's part of Marx's objection to it, because it's not rational to alienate our power to something so capricious, right? Marx also thinks capitalism is coercive because he thinks it presupposes a class of workers, his proletariat, who have few viable alternatives to accepting the terms offered by capitalists. Workers are thus dependent on, at the mercy of the managerial class, and that introduces a dominating relationship between social groups, between the class of the bourgeoisie and the class of the proletariat. It subjects, for reasons I've just mentioned, to persons to human powers that are exercised largely arbitrarily in relation to the real interests of those involved, dictated by the fetish of supply and demand for commodities. So we have to behave the way that the market requires us to behave, rather than having a way for us to force the market to actually serve our real needs. That's Marx's picture. Capitalism is furthermore for him irrational and alienating because it distorts consciousness of human needs and problems, renders people dependent on blind market forces that are nonetheless human forces. I don't have time to talk about this, but he thinks capitalism is inherently unstable and a venue in which persons are thrown into relations of competition, conflict, and struggle, right? And he's certainly right that, since the 19th century, all capitalist societies have been marked by a struggle between capital and labor, right? I mean, trade unions, strikes, constant bargaining about the just wage and so forth. It's constant controversies about the length of the working day, working conditions. That's been, as he predicted, an absolutely staple feature of modern politics ever since capitalism first got going. And finally, capitalism is in an important way immiserating. Under capitalist relations of production, Marx says, work becomes intolerable to the worker, right? It's again connected to the alienation that we were talking about in a previous lecture, but it adds something important, right? Marx thinks that ideally, we would want to labor and do work, because labor actually is one of the most fulfilling things that we can do, right? Marx is not someone who advocates, lazy bums hanging around doing nothing and being unemployed. To the contrary, right? Marx thinks that if you want to live a happy, successful life, you need to work, right? You'll find yourself in your labor, right? But it's precisely for that reason that he's so dissatisfied with labor under capitalist relations of production. Because, as he says, under these conditions, my individuality, I'm on the assembly line, right, is so far externalized that I hate my activity. It is a torment to me, and thus merely a forced activity that is laid on me through an exterior arbitrary need, not an inner and necessary one, right? And, he's pointing out something which we kind of take for granted, but which on the face of it, you might say is kind of outrageous, right? Which is that it's now just accepted that your work is going to be a pain to you, right? We all look forward to the weekend because the work we have to do in the workplace is often, not always, but often so boring, so tormenting, so painful, so difficult, so unpleasant, right? If that's generalized and certain people in society have available to them only work that is like that and that they spend the bulk of their waking lives doing, right? There's an important sense in which their lives are immiserated, in which their lives are diminished by that, right? Marx says, in a truly free society, my work would be a free expression of my life, and therefore a free enjoyment of my life. In that case, as he says, quite movingly, our products would be like so many mirrors out of which our essence shone. And that, Marx thinks, is not something that you can see in people standing on the assembly line or bureaucrats who spend their entire lives, doing boring, form filling out or form checking, right? These are pictures of dehumanized individuals whose life activity is, as he says, a torment to them, and in whose activity we can see nothing of them being reflected out through a mirror of their individuality, right? That ambition is largely unavailable to the vast majority of people under capitalist conditions, and that's one of Marx's major reasons for rejecting it. Now, you might say at this point, and I'll end here, does Marx have an alternative proposal, right? Let's suppose we accept this rather grim picture of capitalism. And in general, the answer is a disappointing one. The general answer is no. Because, and this is not just laziness on Marx's part, it's that he has a philosophical reason for refusing to offer an alternative. Because, as you know, he doesn't think that the problem of capitalism can be solved theoretically. This is a practical problem. It's a historical problem. And in the end of the day, human beings have to actually solve it historically, physically. His thought is certainly philosophical reflection is helpful as a critical spur. It can help us dissolve ideological illusions that conceal the nature of our disease and conceal just how bad and oppressive our social situation is. And Marx thinks he's helping the process along by helping to dispel just those illusions about capitalism. But in the end of the day, the critical analyst who explains what's wrong with capitalism, it's not his responsibility to then provide us with a blueprint to get out of this, right? It's a little bit like a doctor who diagnoses lack of exercise as the reason for our high blood pressure or our heart disease, right? And he says, look, if you want to live another 20 years, and if you want to lower your blood pressure, if you want to protect the health of your heart, you need to go to the gym. You need to start walking regularly. You need to start improving your aerobic fitness, right? But the doctor can't do that for us, right? Nor is it really going to be helpful for the doctor to lay out a kind of blueprint. It's up to us, right, to go out, go to the gym, and actually get ourselves fit. That's what we've got to do. And that's certainly part of Marx's view. We've got to solve our own problems for ourselves. It falls to the philosopher to help us describe what those problems that need to be solved are, but then it's up to us to change the world. It's up to us to reappropriate our common freedom and try to figure out a way of living that isn't oppressive and alienating in the way that capitalism is endemically, on his view. Still, this much is clear. A merely reformist as opposed to revolutionary approach won't, in Marx's view, be helpful, and I'll say more about that in the next lecture. I think it's also clear that Marx would say at a sort of outer limit, no rational society could allow the multitude to be condemned to subsistence or dehumanizing labor at the hands of an acquisitive commercial class whose investments are dictated by the vagaries and caprices of competitive struggle on the market, right? Whatever a better future looks like, it wouldn't be like that, and therefore it wouldn't be like capitalism. A rational society, I think we can also safely say, would in Marx's society, it would, in Marx's view, require everyone to contribute something to the necessary shit work, right? There wouldn't be one class of people that gets to do all of the crummy work, like cleaning out the drains and doing the sewage, and others who spend their lives on the golf course, right? Everyone would have to do their bit, right? Like people on a camping trip, right? Everybody would have to have their turn to clean out the toilet, to do their part to secure the basic subsistence of the society and of everyone living within it, right? Once we've figured out how to distribute those responsibilities so that they fall evenly on everyone, the remaining surplus value, right, would be contributed by and appreciated only for the sake of free agents exploring themselves, living according to their individuality, who they really are, mirrors reflecting their essence out to everybody else. The surplus value would not be extracted and controlled by an impersonal, capricious idol like the market, or only by certain dominant classes, right? That's, roughly speaking, Marx's vision. And yes, it's impossible to imagine that. But notice Marx has a powerful reply to the charge that it's just a utopian dream, right? Marx would say, well, so was capitalism from the point of view of the medieval serf. Suppose you'd gone to a medieval serf in the 13th century and said, you know, one day men and women will be equal. Everyone will have the vote. You'll be able to have in your hand a device that will enable you to speak instantaneously to human beings on the other side of the planet. We'll be able to fly through the air at hundreds of miles an hour and cross oceans in an afternoon, right? And they'd say, or you could point at the moon and say, one day we'll put a guy on that, right? the serf's going to say, oh, fuck you. This is bullshit. That's never going to happen, right? But it has happened, right? So if capitalism can do it, why can't we do it for ourselves in the future? Not clear that hopes for a better alternative are irrational to entertain. All right, I've gone on too long. I'm sorry about that, but I hope it was helpful. One more lecture to go on the home stretch. Love you all. Mwah. See you soon. Bye.